Morning. Is this working? Can you hear me? Can you hear me at the back? Fantastic. Good morning, and thank you, Yoram. I think I heard my name a couple of times during that introduction. And thank you so much for the invitation. And indeed, thank you all for allowing me to speak in English. My Hebrew, or should I say Yiddish? I wouldn't. Hebrew is non-existent, so forgive me if I use my mother tongue. If I do speak too quickly or use words that are a little obtuse, like obtuse, I'm sure you will look at me quizzically, and I'll try and find a different way of saying things. I think I've got, is it 30 minutes or so till 10 past the hour, to tell you a little bit about IBM's perspective, my perspective, on what enterprise architecture is all about. And my strapline more or less sums it up. That we find that life goes a little bit better in the IT world, or indeed in the business world, if you have a degree of confidence that you're doing the right things, rather than the first thing that comes to mind, that you are confident that you have established the right set of projects or the right set of changes that make sense for the enterprise. And that enterprise architecture, by giving you a sense of self, I suppose it might be the best way of putting it, you know more about the organization with architecture than if you didn't have architecture. That allows you to be more confident that you're doing the right things. But it's not really going to be of great value to you if you are confident you're doing the right things, but then don't actually execute on those things in the right way. And therefore, as I'm going to say in a few moments' time, there are two very distinct value propositions, two very distinct benefits from enterprise architecture. And one of the tricks, one of the critical success factors that I found in my time at IBM and working with IBM's clients is that it's a brilliant way of getting it totally wrong if you mix up those two value propositions. That you must be confident that you understand you're using architecture as a means of ensuring we've got the right sense of direction, and then quite separately being sure that we know we're executing on that change in the right, appropriately well-architected way. So maybe as an illustration of what I'm saying, I'm going to tell you a story. Now, I don't know about you here, but back in England, there is a constant craze for do-it-yourself, DIY. Maybe it's got something to do with the economy, I don't know, that we're not rich enough to afford to pay people to come and work on our houses ourselves. We enjoy doing it ourselves. And I'm going to tell you a story about my bathroom. And I'm going to tie my story to the phases that we should be mostly very familiar with in our own industry. So one evening, my wife, because my wife is the CEO, she turned to me and said, "Darling, we want a new bathroom. The one we've got at the moment is getting tired, it's old, it doesn't look as nice as I would like it to." So I say, "Yep, let's have a new bathroom." Being the planner, being the architect, it falls to me to actually work out how much it's going to cost. Can we afford it? And indeed, will it give us all the benefits that my CEO has asked for? Is it a viable proposition to actually execute on this strategy? And given that it passes that first test, portfolio planning if you like, we then go into the phase of design, where I, because I am an engineer in a previous life, sit down with pen and paper and actually lay out the shape and structure of the room, and I'm confident that, we know how to do it. And, of course, I then roll my sleeves up and I actually build it. That's what DIY is all about. It is, in some people's minds, DIY is throw it together and hope it works. Whereas to me, it's more about the planning and the preparation and actually having a sense of direction and having a sense of how it's going to fit together. If you want to bring SOA into my story, service-oriented architecture, am I amongst friends? Can I say same old architecture? But certainly there is a sense that SOA gives me the opportunity to go to this vendor to buy the bath, that vendor to buy the fittings, and guess what? They work together. That I didn't have to make the plumbing, I could buy the plumbing. Service orientation, separation of provision from consumption. So anyway, I developed the bath, and everything in the world is brilliant. Or maybe not. I don't know if you can see well enough at the back. Yoram has told me that you will get this material at the end of the seminar, so you'll be able to see the detail later. My bathroom is perfect. It's just in the wrong place. And I didn't think about its context. I had my head focused on the project. I was worried about the design quality of the suite we were buying or the way in which the bathroom itself was laid out. I didn't focus on the fact that, and I hope this is me rather than my wife, how do you get into the bath? What happens to the wastewater? Where was the privacy? Security being a key issue for us. So what this is trying to say in a relatively light-hearted way is that enterprise architecture is, surprise, surprise, about the architecture of the enterprise. But then I've got to turn to the word architecture and say, well, what did I mean when I talked about the architecture of the enterprise? Well, within the first part of my story, you could say that architecture was understanding the parts of the whole. And finish the sentence there. So I spent the first part of my career in IBM within our Systems Integration Division, SI. And as an architect in SI, I would be engaged by organizations such as yours to keep my metaphor going, design your bathroom for you. And I, as a solution architect, would be focused on understanding the parts of the whole. But now as an enterprise architect, I realized that that wasn't good enough. That it's not just the parts, but it's to do with context. So the value propositions, doing the right things and doing things right, that enterprise architecture brings, is to do with the context, the enterprise context, inside of which all the individual changes, all the individual change programs can take place. Now, Doron, thank you earlier for translating some of Yoram's presentation when you pointed out to me that you had a strapline that talked about something of everything. Because if, as an enterprise architect, I've got to understand the whole house, is my brain big enough to hold within it everything that there is to do with the building as a whole? Probably not. Even though I've lived there for 20 years, I don't know all the nooks and crannies. So if I'm going to provide the context inside of which change takes place, I can't possibly know everything about everything. I have to narrow down the range of topics that I'm interested in across the broader scope of the enterprise. And so to tie this in to the session that Martin is going to do after I've finished, what we have here is a need for an environment that allows me to reason about all the issues across the enterprise. I'm stroking my beard in a rather thoughtful way, so you'll have to think of something else to do if you don't have a beard. I'm thinking about all the issues across the enterprise, from business, IT, information systems, people, finance, HR, manufacturing. I'm thinking about all the issues as an enterprise architect, but only to a relatively shallow level of detail. I'll leave it to the specialists to worry about that finer grained set of issues that are associated with the individual parts. So that's, if you like, my metaphor for enterprise architecture. A little bit about me, probably giving you an insight into where that metaphor comes from, is that I've spent the last 20 years, 24 years, in IBM, working with both IBM's solution architects as well as IBM's enterprise architects, refining our understanding of how this relationship works together. I do have responsibilities within the corporation at a global level. I'm very privileged, and I really do mean privileged, to be responsible for IBM's EA community of practice, where I have 3,000 professionals around the globe who are practicing, who are practitioners of IBM's EA consulting method. Now, to put that into context just very briefly, if you want to think of that as saying TOGAF inside, or whatever is the architecture framework that you as our client would wish to use, then that works for me. There is an approach, if you like, a framework, and I know I will come back to frameworks later, that allows us inside IBM to work with you, or even on our own IT projects, in ensuring architecture works properly. But actually, the thing on this slide that I'm most proud of, because I do think that architecture's time has come, there is a gentleman who would talk about tipping points, and I think enterprise architecture has hit a tipping point, are these two lines. That within IBM, we have a very strong, very well established and respected within the peer community sense of profession. So architects are now beginning to take on a professional status. And much of the success in EA, as I'm going to say in a few minutes' time, is often based on the soft cooperation and coordination skills that enterprise architects have to have, that sense of professional behavior. And it's spreading outside of organizations like IBM or Accenture, Capgemini, Infosys. We all have this, bless you, we all have this same sense of professional qualification within the organization, but actually it's now stepping outside of what you might think of as the vendors into the industry as a whole. And in the United Kingdom, we have a number of professional institutions, engineering institutions, and they are recognizing the role that we play. And I'm probably more proud than anything of being a fellow of the United Kingdom's institute of engineering and technology on the back of being an enterprise architect. I started my career as an aerodynamicist designing aero engines. And in those days, I looked forward to a membership of an institution because it was the norm. Now, within IT, as an enterprise architect, my new profession is joining that same band, that same body. So I've got two sections now to take you through. This first part, I'm going to talk about enterprise architecture as a black box. What it's for, what its value propositions are, what its value is. And to coin a phrase, the return on investment that you might expect from enterprise architecture. The second part, I'll talk a little bit about the internals of enterprise architecture, the white box view, the bits that go inside EA to help you make sure you realize its potential. And if you would be so kind, Yoram, as to give me a 10-minute signal, I'd appreciate that. You may have to grab my attention to give me the signal. You will start, thank you. So here we have to distinguish, and maybe you can make your own choice on which is the most important value proposition for enterprise architecture. And you may also need to decide what is the most urgent. I have found, in my past career in IBM, I've made a lot of money working with our clients to find out why their enterprise architecture isn't actually being as successful as it might be. And most times, it's because these two value propositions are being confused, and more frustratingly, the wrong one has been chosen as the step that will get the architecture function going. Now, I can't judge on any individual situation which of these two is most important, most attractive as the starting point. I'll make a couple of comments in a few minutes' time. Every single enterprise architecture presentation that I've sat there and listened this way to has extolled the virtues, has amplified the role of enterprise architecture as being a tool that underpins planning, underpins strategic planning. There are organizations in which the enterprise architects sit in the same group as the organization's portfolio planners. Strategy and planning is where you'll find the enterprise architects. Enterprise architecture in this guise is focused on understanding the overall shape and structure of the enterprise, stroking its beard a few times, and effectively saying, yes, that's a smart strategy for taking us forward. And there are some, I have a huge respect for the Center for Information Systems Research in MIT, where they've gone a step further and actually equated enterprise architecture with strategy. But to me, that approach or that value proposition that EA brings is full of promise. It gives you a sense of direction. It doesn't necessarily ensure that you hit the target. If I was an archer and I had a bow and arrow, that top, if you like, upstream value proposition means I know where to point the arrow. But then when I let it go, wind and gravity and other such external effects, the context will actually mean the arrow may well not hit the bull, even though I aimed it perfectly. So in many cases, I said I'd come back to this, while this may well be the most obvious and in some organizations the easiest place to start, unless architecture can be found to guide change, all that promise turns into is hot air. Some organizations, and very often it is easier to justify the value of enterprise architecture when one starts in the guiding and governing aspect, not necessarily trying to decide where to aim the arrow, but to actually ensure the arrow does hit the target. And that once you have proven to the business that you as an enterprise architect can bring value by ensuring the target is hit, that that bathroom did fit within the overall context of the organisation, then you may well find you've earned the right to go into the boardroom or into that upstream value proposition and actually then start to influence which targets you're going to aim at. And it's only when, I believe, it's only when you get both of these propositions from the enterprise architects that you'll actually have something that's actionable. You'll turn it from paper, you'll turn it from bright ideas into something that is actually realized in concrete terms on the ground of your organization. So my intent is to avoid that happening. That the bathroom is well designed, but it's in the right context, it fits the house properly, and that it was what we wanted to do first. I didn't go to my wife and say, well, actually, darling, the small amount of savings we have, I do work for IBM, so small amount of savings is a good thing to say. The small amount of savings we have will be better spent here. Only when I can create the bathroom in a sensible and well-organized way will I start to have the right to influence whether or not it should be in the bathroom that we began in the first place. But it goes wider than that. And this is actually quite an important factor in deciding how to start in enterprise architecture. Because I've talked about the house. And I suggested, or my implication was, that the house equated to the enterprise. But a house sits within a broader context. It sits within the street. And in that street, there are expectations that all the houses will draw electricity at the same voltage, or that they will take water at the same pressure, or indeed the other stuff going the other way will be deposited into channels in the right manner. So you could imagine my story was not about an enterprise, because the enterprise was the street. My story was actually about a small part of the enterprise. It could have been about a line of business. It could have been about a large program. And quite a few organizations embark upon their EA journey not at the enterprise level at all, but within programs where there is a complex amount of engineering, to use that term in a generic manner, there's a complex amount of engineering to be done. And coordination and cooperation are equally important at that smaller scale. So start enterprise architecture within programs and grow it upwards. The startup cost is lower, the complications politically are lower, the return on the investment is lower, but it gives you a place to start. But also, of course, one of the key things, whether you're dealing with the enterprise, a line of business, a program, whatever it might be, no amount of fine engineering, nor indeed any amount of good navigation, will be worth anything if you're not connected to the strategy. And this, my respects to Scott Adams. Dilbert remains my favourite series, and this is my favourite Dilbert. For those of you at the back, I presume you can't read the words. It's basically saying that if I have a project where the requirements are not understood, of all my projects, I like the doomed ones best. We've got to start anyway, even though we didn't know what our objectives were. So to tie it into strategy, whether it's the strategy for the enterprise, the program, or the line of business, is vital. And being an Englishman, please forgive me if I call upon an English philosopher from 400 years ago, who said, and this is Thomas Hobbes, you can Google him if you wish at some point, that freedom within the law, without which the life of man, or let's call it the life of an architect, would be solitary, poor, brutish and short. That architecture is effectively the law. It is the rules, the guidelines, the common behaviours that we all agree to follow in order to make life more comfortable. If you take architecture away, then that freedom that you would still have is actually anarchy. So freedom within the law is what architecture will bring an enterprise, as compared to freedom, which is where you get my cartoon house, which is anarchic. But why bother? How do I, in my role in IBM, visit my potential clients and argue the case that says, architecture's good for you, believe me? No, doesn't tend to happen. It can happen, and it has happened, and it does happen where the board, the CXO, the Chief Executive Officer, or one of his or her colleagues, is just so fed up with failure after failure after failure of IT or the business or a combination of both to deliver on the promise that they say, why is it not going well? And an intellectual argument at that level will win. And I wake up and I realise I was dreaming. You know, those situations are pretty rare. So I've got to, with your collaboration, work out how to justify enterprise architecture. Now, there are clearly cost tangible benefits. Now, I always resist talking about return on investment, because return on investment tends to be somewhat practical, quantitative, dollars in your hand. Whereas architecture, just like project management, is actually somewhat more abstract than that. Architecture is about managing risk. The probability of hitting the target is higher if you have architecture than if you don't. Project management, the probability of delivering on time is higher with project management than if you don't. But nonetheless, and I'll give you an example, numerical example in a few minutes, nonetheless, there are tangible benefits. Cost avoidance, avoiding the purchase of incompatible architectures or incompatible elements. My bath fitted with the brassware. You know, I don't know if you have the same here, forgive me for being ignorant of this fact, but in the United Kingdom we officially abandoned our migration from imperial to metric halfway through. So my children were all taught meters and centigrade, and then when they learn to drive, they have to judge their distance in miles per hour. So there is value in architecture in avoiding incompatibilities. And I won't go through that list, but the point being that architecture, sitting between the strategic sense of direction and the delivery on that direction, gives you a sense of ready, aim, fire. I took a moment to say that because I'm much more used to saying ready, fire, aim, which is what you tend to get if you don't have a sense of enterprise architecture. Before I give you some sense of numbers, I do want to point out that actually the greatest value can actually come from intangible benefits. And this is often only justifiable in situations of great pain. I have one occasion, one very notable occasion, been in a planning meeting in which the people in the room with me said, "We're not feeling pain." Well, that's fine. Don't change. Only when there is pain being felt will architecture actually be of its greatest value. But what I've done in this slide is point out some of the key words. Architecture is about things like common vision, consensus, discussion, healthy discussion, organisation, communications, language. These are the things that project managers would be saying. And we never question the involvement of a project manager in the projects that we run. But in any one situation, you can, and indeed I have done, and I'll give you some clients that I've worked with in a slide or two's time. I have sat down at the table with people such as yourselves, and we've identified what the key tangible benefits are that organisation can see coming from architecture. This is an engagement with an American utility of 2 or 3 years ago now, and we worked with them that these were the 3 key tangible things that they knew they had to address. One of them was a no-brainer: reduce duplicate product implementations. Although it was no-brainer, the value was only 1.5 million. Others that implied a greater degree of effort in achieving an architectural capability returned far greater amounts of reward. The return on the investment was far greater. We also, obviously, you have to make an investment. And tools are a part of that investment. They're often the most visible and obvious investment that you make in architecture. But let's not actually forget about the practical energy that you have to put into your people. Architecture is about culture change and organisation change and behaviour change. And that will take training and it'll take time. But the return far outweighs the cost. Now, I'm not going to say that in any one of these situations, those 3 factors are the right 3. It could be any of those from my earlier slide. Neither am I going to say exactly what the return that you would see would be. That's down to your situation. But the numbers can be done. 10 minutes, yes, thank you. Yes, I noticed you were standing, but I didn't acknowledge you. I wanted to be sure that I pulled out examples that were not from my own experience, because I could be standing here as, I'm standing here as an enterprise architect, first and foremost. The fact that this badge says IBM is more a question of who pays my salary than being an enterprise architect. So I've gone back to Jeannie Ross and her Centre for Information Systems Research and pulled out a slide from one of the decks that they have available on their website. This is to do with Toyota, and that they are, one would say, including the value of architectural compliance to their overall performance in terms of reduction of vehicle lead time and so on. Notice that it says compliance. So this clearly relates to that downstream value proposition of guiding and governing change rather than being directly related to the inspiring role that architecture might bring. The Institute for EA Developments, a Dutch-based organisation, more a federation of architects rather than being an out-and-out commercial organisation, have also established substantial savings for the American various 8, I think there's 8, architecture initiatives in the federal government of the United States. But I think one of the key issues that I have to highlight, whichever of those 2 value propositions you identify as being the one that works for you, one of the discussions that I have very often is, with enterprise architects, getting them to lift their heads and saying, who are you doing it for? Who is your stakeholder? It might be that you have an opportunity to influence, to use architecture as a means of influencing at the highest levels of the organization. The important people, the people who sit on the board of directors. And your value proposition to them will be to do with the return on investment of all their change budget. So you are maximizing the ROI, as it says here, for their overall IT budget. I'd like to change this slide, and I probably should, to say IT and business change, because of course enterprise architecture is about both parts. But it doesn't have to be the board of directors. Enterprise architecture has a very distinct value proposition to those not quite so important as the board, but in investment terms, they tend to be richer. Because the investment budget that your organizations have is often delegated down to the lines of business who are then sponsoring and funding the change. And so your value proposition to that community is somewhat different, to do with project risk and integration challenges, rather than being an overall top-line ROI. But what about the folks in operations? What about the people who are having to run the systems that we're responsible for architecting? It would be rather nice if our architecture made the systems that they're having to operate a little easier to run, that they didn't turn out to be the Gordian knot that they so often are. And so our value proposition to that community is also quite different. So 3 distinct value propositions to 3 different sets of stakeholders. But critically, these are all within the one enterprise, because there is one EA capability, maybe represented by the people in this room, that is offering those 3 distinct value propositions to each of these 3 different parts of the enterprise. So again, a critical success factor is know your audience. Who are you selling your value proposition to? The value that architecture brings is different for each of these parts of the organization. And there's, that is often, as I said a moment ago, the biggest challenge organizations find, architects find, is knowing who's buying what I'm selling. So very, very quickly, and I may overrun by just a minute or two, I want to talk very, very briefly about the insides of architecture. Because an earlier version of this presentation was called Enterprise Architecture More Than Just an Architecture. If I've got an architecture, what value is that? There has to be a much broader architectural, if you like, ecosystem to actually make this of value. So I've got to actually work out that, okay, strategy, Captain Kirk, no, it was Jean-Luc Picard, said, make it so, on Star Trek. So Enterprise is probably a good name for what we do. And that without any of his fine engineering and navigation staff, that make it so would be rather more a fire and hope. That it's architecture that actually gives us that sense of direction, that there's the planning function that sits between the inspiration and the perspiration to actually ensure that the sense of direction is achieved in practice. We as enterprise architects are a conduit. We actually not only interpret and transform from top to bottom, we also have a responsibility, as I said yesterday to some clients, you've got to be joking. The enterprise architect is responsible for saying back to the board or back to the portfolio planners, I'm sorry, but that just won't work. and then with justification because you've done the architectural thinking. So there's a very strong analogy with town planning, at least in terms of from the strategy to the city plan down to the permission to build that new house or the extension or the new factory, whatever it might be, within the city as a project within the overall landscape. But just as with the city planning analogy, there are two roles. In the city planner's office, there are planners who give you permission to build that new building, and there are city engineers. At least in my experience, you ask permission for a house, they give you permission, and then they come on site. They visit to check that the lintels across the door are the right thickness, that the power supply is the right height above the floor, that there are two doors between a bathroom or a toilet and an area where food is prepared. So that both aspects of this diagram, both from strategy down to architecture, down to delivery, and back again, is covered by the notion of town planning and city engineering. To make that work, there has to be detail on the inside. And I'm not going to go through that detail now, time is against me. But the point being that architecture is only part of the overall story that enterprise architects are responsible for. Maybe I should make this my last slide. I could spend several hours just on this one slide, but it does highlight how the whole scope of what we do can be captured. That there is a sense of direction, strategic intent. Captain Jean-Luc Picard saying, make it so. We need an architecture, if you like, a sense of self, where the self is the enterprise. I can look at the enterprise and say, yes, I can be a 100-meter runner. Well, maybe a few years ago I could have been a 100-meter runner. But by understanding the enterprise, you can be confident that that strategy is viable. If I look at myself and say, yeah, I can be a 100-meter runner, what do I have to do in order to achieve that goal? Well, go on a diet. So I, as the architect, I, as the enterprise architect, have to have a role in transition planning. I have to get out of my office and go to the portfolio planners and say, I think Ian needs to go on a diet, or Ian needs to join a gym, or Ian needs to change his lifestyle in some way because he wants to be a 100-meter runner. The portfolio planners decide that Ian can't do all of those things, and going on a diet is impossible. He just won't keep to it. So portfolio planning decides which of the projects, join a gym and change your lifestyle, we're actually going to embark upon. Through architecture, these are our blueprints. We've been able to inspire in a more engineeringly robust way the projects that we want to actually execute on. But of course, if I'm going to join a gym, I don't know what it's like here in Israel, 90% of all people who belong to a gym never go. So we've now got to, as architects, instruct those responsible for solution design to say, go to the gym, and when you go to the gym, this is what you do when you get there. This is called guidance. But guidance without governance, did you go? And if you didn't go, why not? And there may be reasons why not going to the gym is a good thing. We won't actually get the feedback that we need to say that the architecture is being followed. So I've got a solution life cycle drawn here, 3 times over, 3 separate programs. How do I keep them in step with each other? How do I keep in step over my dieting and my visiting the gym and my changing of lifestyle? By having architectural guidance that keeps those things in step. But human beings, being human beings, never do what they're asked to do. So we need a sense of governance that says, are we designing these systems the way we said we wanted them designed? And guess what happens? You don't go to the gym. You don't design the system the way you said it should be designed. Where does the fault lie? Where does the reason lie for that, quote, failure to conform? It doesn't lie in the fact that I didn't go to the gym. It lies in the fact that I was asked to go in the first place, because it was never going to work. So what we fundamentally have to do as architects is we have to have a control loop. Are our target architectures still right? Is it still right to impose that security algorithm or that customer contact system or that business process? Is that standard building block still relevant for our enterprise? So actually on this diagram, one of the most important parts of it are not the clouds, which are, by the way, English irony, because enterprise architects have often been accused of being up in the clouds or at 30,000 feet. So enterprise architecture here is drawn within my pink clouds. It's the arrows that make the difference. And it's actually the analysis that I, as an enterprise architect, can do on the viability and efficacy of my architecture that makes the difference. That it's this loop here, as well as this one, but it's this loop here that actually, and you'll show some analytical, yes? So Martin, in his demonstration, is going to show how we can check to see if the architecture is still meeting the needs of the business through our tools. But that doesn't stop you. In fact, it should not impact you from going out and talking to the solution designers and making sure that they understand why your architecture works the way it does. But I could go on, and I will, in the file that I give to you, Yoram, I will make sure that the subsequent slides are there. And if there are discussions or debates to be had from them, I'll happily take them. Thank you very much.